McPhip, before I even came to Michigan. Okay. I was involved through the National Youth Leadership Council, and we ran their camps together, remember, the McPhip summer camps. And then for CMF, I've primarily been a program officer, and then, of course, various subcommittees or such that might have come up. M&A program officer, and then the Michigan Community Service Commission, a commissioner, 6 to 7 years. So been involved with all of them, yeah. Absolutely, and I'll just come at it from, I was in Minnesota when I became in touch with a movement that was popping around the country and became aware of it. And I was actually in graduate school studying to be a clinical social worker, and I'll get more into this later when we talk about my journey, but I was really focusing on, I had a strong commitment to young people, but focusing on it from a clinical perspective of children and families. And so I was leading groups around self-esteem, children of divorce, children of violent homes. And I started noticing out in the streets that there was something happening in terms of more activity starting to build in which young people were no longer the recipients of the help from adults, but they were beginning to stand up and becoming a part of the solution. And in Minnesota, I was on a group called the Twin Cities Youth Policy Forum. And we began tapping into that. And it was a policy forum that was focused on youth workers and youth serving organizations. We would hold forums that would bring about 200 people together. And what we noticed was that suddenly there was this flip happening around young people as actors instead of victims, young people as assets instead of needy recipients or assets instead of focusing on the deficits of what young people needed. And I remember we had buttons that youth as resources. We began really stepping into what was happening around the country. And what was the beginning of the youth service movement in the late 80s. And it was at that time that I was connected to two organizations, the Search Institute, which, if you heard about Peter Benson, and then Jim Kielsmeyer had founded the National Youth Leadership Council. And it was while I was in graduate school, I took on this position of the Twin Cities Youth Policy Forums that they had co-created. And that's when I got a sense around, there was this movement, and I eventually came to work for the National Youth Leadership Council, and that's when I became aware. We thought we were progressive in Minnesota, but Michigan was actually further down the road than we were as a state. And that's when I ran into you, Kathy, ran into so many others that were not only just talking about young people as assets and resources, you were really starting to put some firm stakes into the ground around it. And that was my first introduction to the Community Foundation's Youth Project, which to me was one of the stellar projects around the country because it was doing two things. One, it was it wasn't just talking about young people being in the driver's seat. It was actually giving people the power and the decision making that comes with the distribution of resources. That was a powerful statement as to how much young people were trusted by the people here, and how much responsibility they could take on. And so to me, it was a premier, early out of the gate, stellar program that really showed the power of what young people could do. It was an actual experiential scenario that involved real-life activity that we invited participants to become a part of. And we put people into various groups. Actually, it's much akin to Survivor these days. It's funny, 15 years later, where we created very short-term teams who had obstacles to overcome. Everything from getting across a lake with just a couple of inner tubes when you had a group of 12. But at the National Youth Leadership Council, we firmly believed that the best way to learn something was to experience it. And another important piece of that work then was to bring in a social justice lens. So basically, we felt very strongly that in the case of the Michigan Community Foundation's Youth Project, if young people were going to be giving money away, right? So if any of us step into the power and the privilege of distributing resources, it's really important for us to understand what the implications of that are, and also what are the realities around poverty, social justice, and injustices that are out there. And we crafted this experiential activity. And I remember some of the key parts that had to do with it were basic. Every group was always given a series of tasks in which there wasn't enough. There weren't enough boats, there weren't enough inner tubes, there wasn't enough food. And much like Survivor today, that each group would have to figure out how they were going to deal with that lack of resources or lack of adequate resources. And it brought out a tremendous amount of soul searching, tremendous amount of tension. They were creative tensions that were intentionally put into the group, and asked people to really think about the impacts of decision making. Who received, who didn't? How did a group behave in terms of how they dealt with not enough resources? So they were creative scenarios that people were put into. And I think at that time, you're right, Kathy, it really provided an opportunity for young people to not only experience something kinesthetically, it also was facilitated to ask a lot of questions that have to do with resources, who has, who doesn't, and allow people to experience something perhaps that they hadn't in terms of inadequate resources. For young people, well, my basic sense was the signature program was the Michigan Community Foundation's Youth Project for Youth. I thought that was the strength of it, was that you had one organizing principle that was used around how you would engage young people. You had principles around who would be engaged, how they'd be engaged, how long. You had principles around the role of adults and the relationship to young people. And so I think the real strength was that there was one solid, large program that the foundations in this state, including the Kellogg Foundation, made the wise decision of resourcing well and thinking well out into the future. That was very unusual. I hadn't seen anything like that around the country. Surely hadn't seen it in Minnesota. And there could have been choices to make, to invest in a number of different programs. And I think there was great wisdom in really putting all of your values, your assumptions, and a unique program into one umbrella. Well, I think, again, the Michigan Community Foundation's Youth Project brought youth philanthropy to the forefront on the national and the international arena. It really did. There was a lot happening around youth service, right, back in the late 80s and into the 90s. When I came to the foundation in 1993, we had done a lot of investing in youth service programming, but we hadn't done much around this area of service learning, of young people learning about learning their subject matter, their academic subject matter, while they were getting deeply involved in their communities. So our team at the time decided this would be a place that we thought had potential and we would invest more into it. So what happened, I think, in terms of Michigan's contribution was you had this strong youth philanthropy program already. And our team at the foundation decided we would invest more squarely into service learning, as we saw it as having potential. It was perhaps lagging behind the broader youth community service movement, and we thought we could make a difference. So we invested a targeted effort in an initiative called Learning Indeed, in which we addressed issues of visibility around service learning, of research, of field connectivity, and collective action in the field. And I think what I saw happen in Michigan was that the Michigan Community Youth Project seized the rising knowledge and interest in service learning and combined it with the youth philanthropy to make a very powerful curriculum, Learning to Give. And again, you didn't see that kind of combo much around the country. There were a few other organizations doing it. But again, not with the focus. I think we have a signature theme here that there was a focus of really gathering resources and putting them behind one key effort, just as the Michigan Community Foundation's Youth Project had been a lot of energy and a lot of clarity and focus around one idea. Learning to Give became that also. And in keeping that kind of focus and the kind of momentum that was being built, I believe you made a contribution very much to the national and international fields. Now, Learning Indeed crafted this commission led by Senator John Glenn and a bunch of other notables, governors across the state, Buffy St. Marie, local researchers. And I believe what we were able to do was to really bring some attention to the notion of the potential of this notion of service learning. I think we were also able to really put some money behind gathering researchers who were studying it, getting them to be more connected, and then finally working with practitioners in the field who would be able to get more strategic about how they were educating, how they were developing curriculum, and what their own agenda was. I think it's a couple of different factors, and it has to do with consistent leadership. Many times in other states, I've watched in the service, national community service movement, the states that seem to have made the most progress were the ones whose leaders stayed in the game and stuck with, again, some simple ideas and stayed with things long enough and thought about sustainability early enough to be able to build some kind of foundations that could weather the individual storms. And I think that we had a set of one of those perfect storms in a good way. We had leaders who worked well together, who saw eye to eye well enough that they could begin thinking long-term about legacy. And you don't see that often. I think there's a certain appreciation for legacy in this state that I haven't seen in other states. And there's a mentality of people willing to perhaps give up some of their own personal opinions in order to unite with others to build some things that will outlast them. It's the good to great piece. It's the cathedral building concept. I think we have a phenomenal group of leaders at that time who have been cathedral builders. They've said, we're going to do our part in laying a foundation that will outlast any one of us. So it's a particular mentality, and I think it's a storm of leaders. Plus, we were also in the height of opportunity when it came to the nonprofit sector, came to the service movement, came to the various governors. I think people were smart in this state around really being open to working with each governor, because we've switched parties over the years, but really doing that proper outreach to build strong relationships. Having the Service Commission being led by the First Lady or the First Gentleman was a very smart move. You know, I think that people have been strategic here, far more strategic and more connected than I've seen as a commissioner with other states across the nation. I also want to say I think it's made a big difference to have that. I don't want to underplay the Kellogg Foundation's role in terms of its ongoing commitment. Out of my 18 years at the foundation, you know, a good 15 of them were involved in being a program officer devoted to these kinds of infrastructure issues. And I think we had a set of trustees who understood the importance of building infrastructure, who understood the importance of seizing the moment with the leadership, with the external context. And we had an unusual department called Philanthropy and Volunteerism. And that ongoing commitment of funding and building this infrastructure, I think, was a critical point in having this happen.
Let's talk a little bit.
Yeah, I think that as long as I've been at the Kellogg Foundation, I've found a great wisdom from our leadership that understood that money alone is not enough, and that we actually have a commitment to investing many parts of who we are into our investments, and that currently plays out now. We invest financial resources, we invest human resources, we invest our connection to networks, and actually I've often thought about, when I look at my history as a program officer, for me personally, a lot of it has been in spawning new networks, in gathering people together. In fact, even now when we ask grantees, what's the most important thing we can do for you? Over and over and over again, they say, get us together, bring us together. We so need to, but the press of everyday matters keeps us from connecting. So I think our foundation has held a long time commitment to that notion of creating networks, supporting networks. And then we also are increasingly committed to sharing our knowledge. We could go a lot further in this direction. We sit on a lot of knowledge, but we're wanting to contribute more and more. And I think the consistency of program staff who've been involved in Michigan, they brought that knowledge that we had the privilege of having view to when we sat on these boards, when we developed relationships with key players. And then finally, I think our reputation helped. Having the Kellogg Foundation get in there and stick with this issue of the nonprofit sector, the service sector, the philanthropy sector. I think that made a big difference, just hanging in there and bringing who we were and all that we represented. I think that, again, it was a perfect storm of a unique set of leaders in the right places at the right time, connected to each other. It's actually just great field strategy. I don't know how intentional it was. I believe it was a way of doing things here. I believe it was a personal commitment to the players involved. It was how they got things done in Michigan. And it's a testament to how much was done in the last 15 years or so. So I believe that, if you take a look at, from just my perspective, at that time, our CEO was Russ Mawby, Dottie Johnson on our board, Joe Oros as, leading and creating the whole philanthropy and volunteerism team. I think that Kyle Caldwell, yourself, Kathy, Kathy Agard, in the various roles that you played, Kyle has hung in there building infrastructure in this state for a tremendous amount of time. So when you take a look at Rob Collier, some of the players that were in play when I came to the state are still in the game. And that is very impressive. They're still making things happen, every single one of you. And so I think you can't underestimate the power of commitment over time. When I've examined the investments that the Kellogg Foundation has made, having been there for as long as I've been there, and I ask, what has made the difference? One of the things that I've come to see is that reality of commitment over time is crucial. That foundations can't expect to make deep, lasting change in 2 or 3 years. If you're serious about something, you have to really set your sights on where you're going. Put some boundaries around it so you don't stray too far or get spread too thin, and then stay in the game for a good 10 years before I think you really start seeing some changes. But the combination of leadership, people being in the right positions at the right time, working together, and all of us, including myself as a program officer, I believe we were like-minded and we were clear about where we wanted to go. And when someone came up with a brilliant idea that might help move where we were at further along the lines, people lined up and supported each other. And I think you can't underestimate that. I also think, when you said about power, I think every single person I've mentioned was very strategic about how they used their power in order to move forward a bigger goal. Lots of times you have organizations that pull against each other around an issue because they want to create their own niche. What I saw was that in this state, people did a great job of getting behind one idea, and they clicked off several of them in about 15 years, getting behind one idea and pulling together around it, a bit like a team of horses versus a series of individual riders. And that's quite unusual, and I think it's really yielded results. The only thing that came to me when I was asking your questions really wasn't history, but it was this sense of asking a question around who's up next and what's up next, and what has the thinking that has gone into that. Really, I think it's a question that we all need to be thinking about. And did we, in doing all of this phenomenal work, have we created the conditions and the circumstance for the next set of leaders who are coming up to be able to act in much of, to be able to gain from what was done before, to learn the wisdom of what was done before, and to act collectively the way our predecessors have and our current leaders.
Weighs on my mind. So if you have an answer to that one, or was it just a question?
It's just a question. I think for me, I'm not seeing it. We're really reflecting what the whole sector. I'm paying attention to leadership now in the state, and so maybe I'll have an opportunity to raise this question. But as I've studied leadership, we did a scan across the country now, taking a look at what's going on with leadership, and there is a gap that I've seen that they talk about the boomers. The boomers are staying in longer, and perhaps the criticism from those underneath the boomers is that not enough energy has gone into really preparing, working collectively with, and thinking about, rather than doing the work, who's going to take the mantle when I let go. And it's not an issue that's specific to Michigan, but I think it's an issue that is upon us all. Anybody who cares about whatever movement you're in, it seems to be a typical oversight. So what I would challenge our state to do is to really, in this particular subject, ask the question of who's up next, what's up next, and what can those those participants, those leaders who have built what's happened, what will they do in terms of contributing to that next up? And it's really just, it's an observation that I've actually, not a chosen number, just by surveying a lot of different projects. 5's too little, 7's okay, 10 is when, and I've talked to other colleagues in philanthropy, 10 is where you start seeing more return on investment. And again, it varies. I mean, I'm talking about dealing with larger efforts, bigger movements, but I would even say that when we surveyed, when we reinvested, when we anteed up our investment in service learning, when we talked to a lot of the leaders in the service learning field, many of them said it was Kellogg's long-standing commitment to the service movement and to service learning that really kept things moving forward. So for me, it's a key ingredient, and 5 clearly isn't enough, and 10 is getting in closer. Hard for philanthropies to think about that, but it somewhere between 5 and 10 is where you can start seeing some impact. I didn't choose philanthropy. Okay. Philanthropy chose me, and accidentally. It's one of those accidental, wonderful experiences. I was actually a youth development professional and involved in youth camping, and I was very involved in young people and the whole notion of getting young people out into nature to better understand their relationship with nature. I had an undergraduate in environmental studies, wilderness education, designed an experiential undergraduate myself where I was out in the field 2 out of my 4 years, and had a real, just had some very crucial, pivotal experiences around how I believe people learn. And so that was a backdrop for when I began running youth camps and realized that when people came to my camp, they were in Northern Illinois, when they came to my camps, when they unpacked their clothes, they also unpacked their lives. And so I learned a lot about cutting my teeth on how important community is in terms of creating experiences for people, because it wasn't just young people, we had families involved, we had teenagers involved, how important community is and the support of community for people to take the risks to more deeply understand themselves, to become vulnerable, and then to transform themselves. And so it was that backdrop that then led me, as people unpacked their suitcases and their lives, they also unpacked their problems, And that was when I realized I really wanted to learn how to help people solve their problems more effectively. I went to Minnesota, the University of Minnesota, decided to choose social work because I believed it was the most broad span degree. I looked at it, psychology degrees, counseling degrees. These were all things that taught me about how you could support people in solving the problems of their lives. I chose social work in Minnesota because I wanted a broader degree and to be in a pro-social environment. That I wanted to be in a state that had very progressive social policy. And that was very much to their Finnish, Norwegian roots that were brought over to Minnesota, very pro-social, very social-oriented. So it was while I was there, and I started doing internships and work after my graduate degree, that I was doing clinical social work with children, youth, and families, that I started noticing while I was leading groups with young people, again, about death in their family, violence in their family, whatever life was bringing to them, divorce, self-esteem issues, adoption. I noticed that while I was sitting around talking to young people about their lives, while I was running these youth policy forums, I was watching young people who were discovering who they were by engaging with their communities. So they weren't doing this in a unique, in kind of a vacuum. They were out in the community, and as they were giving and getting engaged with their community, they were radically changing how they saw themselves, and their community was radically changing how they saw young people. And my final assessment was this was far more transformative. This was far more transformative than the groups that I was running. So this notion of if you allow people to get into their community, experience, engage, more transformation was possible than sitting around and talking about whatever it was on their minds. I took a job then with the National Youth Leadership Council. I realized that doing individual therapy wasn't changing things enough. I began understanding that I really was much more of a systems thinker. I didn't quite realize it, but it was my beginning of understanding that. Worked for the National Youth Leadership Council where I could have a national lens, ended up being hired to manage a $1 million Kellogg grant around K-12 service learning back in 1990. And over 3 years, I managed that grant. Again, learned more about community building, learned more about collective action with a group of players across the country that were very diverse. Native American man down in New Mexico, leaders out in Boston and in the Massachusetts area, as well as Washington. We all came together and said, what do we want to move? Very similar to what Michigan was doing. Leaders coming together saying, what's the agenda? How can we be strategic? And then it was after 3 years of managing that grant that I got a call from Joe Loros, who said, would you consider putting an application in? And I had found out it was Stephanie Closey, who I had worked with in Iowa, had just come out of the Kellogg Foundation, had put my name forward. And I began my set of multiple visits to the Kellogg Foundation, and then eventually was hired by Joel, working with a small team, to build this new area called the Philanthropy and Volunteerism Programming Area. Well, in the Kellogg Foundation back in the 80s, again, the foundation has always had a commitment to young people. I believe Joel and his colleagues in what was called the Youth and Education Programming Area started noticing this bubbling up of this service movement among young people. And they began getting more requests for grants, organizations called Christmas in April, the Campus Outreach Opportunity League, cool. The Corporation for National Service was being formed. Norm Brown, our president at the time, was asked by President George Bush Sr., would he be a part of creating something called the Points of Light Foundation? So again, there were a number of confluences that were happening that was turning the Kellogg Foundation's attention in this direction. That's often how it works. we see what's happening out in the world based on the tone or the content of the requests we're getting. We noticed that happening around philanthropy by and for communities of color. There was a period where suddenly we started getting these requests from organizations that were working on building culturally based funds within foundations or community foundations. And that was another example of, what's going on here? And we started learning more about that and crafted an entire body of work now called Cultures of Giving. So what was that about? So Joel Oros, I believe, after having done made some grants around this youth service activity that was starting to pop up around the country, I believe that he had enough conversations within the building with leadership to bring in some more expertise, and myself and another program officer were hired to bring in some expertise around this area, those of us who had been working in it, and to go ahead and create a body of work in which we would be funding it. We didn't know then that it would become a fourth leg of the foundation stool at the time, but we built up quite a big portfolio then, really funding a lot of these new efforts that were happening across the country. My parents were quite unconventional. My mother was a school teacher, my father was a farmer, but every summer they both could step away from the farm and from the classroom, and they would get a map and draw a big circle around the country, up into Canada, a little bit down into Mexico, and we would spend a month as a family traveling around the country, seeing the world. And by the time I was 12, I had been to 42 of these United States. And I had been exposed to so much of the grandeur of this country. We stayed at the national parks when there weren't very many people there. And we were exposed to all kinds of educational activities. And it was by being able to see our nation and to meet so many different people and to go into Mexico and to go to the little Mexican church and to go up into Canada and climb up the steps of the cathedral in Montreal on our knees because that was the local tradition. It actually, I think, built a fire in me for experiential education and for understanding how crucial wilderness and the out of doors were. So that led me to then get involved in youth camping. And I think I understood how important youth experiences are. That what I heard in my camps all the time, how I got into community was that I directed these camps I was involved with these local camps for a good 7 or 8 years. And I saw how year after year young people would come back and they would tell me over and over again, I get to be here who I cannot be at home. And I think it built a fire and a passion in me in terms of understanding how crucial these early experiences are for young people. I still have camp staff that are all connected on Facebook, campers that connect up to these early formative experiences. And I ask, why are they so formative? And what I came down to thinking is that it's so much about acceptance, love, community, belonging, within the context of an environment like a camp. And so I think it's these youth development perspectives, these youth development experiences that really shaped my commitment to making sure that we have opportunities for young people. You know, when I was at the Kellogg Foundation, many times we would have Jane Addams Fellows from Indiana University. Many young people would come through the Kellogg Foundation and meet with us as program officers. And many times I would be asked to do informational interviews with young people in their 20s usually, who are exploring careers. And it'll bring me back to my original story of how did I get into philanthropy. They would say, I want to be a foundation program officer. What do I do? And I would say to them time and time again. And I just had an informational interview with another young woman probably a month ago, asking the very same thing, 25 years old, trying to impart her path. And my theme that I say is not changed over the last 15 years, and it reflects my own experience. One is that I never intended to get involved in philanthropy. It was never on my radar screen. In fact, I had hardly interacted with program officers myself. But what I did take the time to do, and what I was blessed with mentors and employers and other key influencers in my life, was that every single one of them around my path, at least I found, and I held on to them, were the people who helped me find my passion. And they helped reflect to me, what was it? What were my gifts to give? What was I good at naturally, right? And when a person can get in touch with that and stay in touch with that and shape their work life around it, there's a fire and a passion that gets mixed with the experience and with the knowledge that we each gain over time. And it's when you get that combination, you become a very powerful actor in the world. And I think that how I got into philanthropy was I was just passionate about what I was doing. And it was just fortuitous that I was in the right place at the right time, and someone to manage a Kellogg grant was needed. And I did that work, and then there was a need at the Kellogg Foundation, and I said yes. We both said yes. So my advice is always do what you love. Pay attention to not only your work, but to the broader field of what you're engaged in. And then let philanthropy find you, because it will. What's next for me? Whoa, that's a great question.
What's on your horizon?
I am actually thinking very much about this leadership question, and it has found its way on my plate at the Kellogg Foundation, but I've been around long enough, and I'm still at the foundation, that I can really bring some sense of history and long view to the issue. I think what I'm passionate about is this issue of when we create something and when it's put in place, what will happen after we step away? What is our responsibility to those who are working in the younger generations? Everyone who is connected. How do we gather people together to get more collective around what needs to happen and to think generationally what will happen? And I think our leaders here in Michigan thought well about the long haul. And I think I'm pretty passionate about how do we get people collective enough, networked enough, and thinking not only forward, but what's going to happen after each one of us steps away. How are we preparing those coming after us so that the same effort and energy and the supports are there for their passions going forward? I would like to add, I haven't stated it directly, but I think when it comes to the leadership piece, and I think in my own life journey, I think what brought me to the social work perspective was that I was raised in a middle-class family, maybe lower middle class. We were out on a farm. We were 90% self-sufficient. I think it was probably my Catholic upbringing as well as my own parents' agrarian ethic that on a farm, and when you live in a rural community, it's very much a part of life that if one farmer needs help, everyone goes over and helps. It's the thing you talk about with the Amish barn raisings. When you live in rural America, that's how you survive. And I think that ethic, combined with the social justice lens that I received from a bunch of young radical nuns when I was in high school, has influenced me to always ask the question of who are the haves and who are the have-nots? And what's the responsibility of those haves to those have-nots? And I think that these are crucial questions as we move into what's an ongoing recession that some have already called a depression because it's felt very unequally right now. And I think we in Michigan have a strong responsibility. We've been called the canary in the coal mine around this particular recession. And I think we can do better than we're even doing. around thinking about the economy and who's it affecting and how is it affecting whom. And so at the foundation, we really have placed a high emphasis on racial equity. So you ask, who are the have-nots? Who has and who doesn't? What are the various prejudices and institutional biases that we can sometimes take for granted, institutional racism, and how do we make sure we really weave that into our consciousness as we move forward? So I haven't brought that out, but I just think it's a crucial agenda for Michigan. I think we have a long ways to go in it, and that I think it's our personal challenge. And for those of us that continue to keep building the infrastructure, I think we need a very particular focus on weaving that into what we do.